All right, welcome to this episode. This is, I think, episode 2, although I'm recording this one before I've even released episode 1. So, I mean,
Stack
them up. This will be episode 2.
Stack them up.
And what this is our FTK over the air react series. I think I'm going to make this a series of 2 at least so far, where we've done a podcast. Lynne and I met with Brett Shavers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. And then now we're going to sit down with Kate Davenport, and we'll introduce her in a second. And we're going to talk about the podcast, some of the thoughts that Kate had while listening to that. And we'll just kind of go through it, not in any sort of structure, just our thoughts. And also, if our listeners have any input, any comments, thoughts, you can always put it in the comments below the video, or you can email us at ftkovertheair@exterro.com. We would love to hear from you if you want to be a guest on the podcast or even react to another podcast. If you have something you want to talk about with an episode, hit us up. We're always happy to have new and exciting guests on the show. And speaking,
this is going to be exactly like it is on like Bravo TV, you know, where they react to episodes of The Real Housewives. This is exactly the same format.
Exactly. And maybe we'll even...
Exactly.
Should we just react to The Real Housewives?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Let's cut to that.
Do it.
Yeah.
So speaking of new and exciting guests, though, we have someone that's never been on the podcast or the YouTube channel so far, and that is Kate Davenport of the Exterro training team. She's an instructor here. Kate, welcome to this, whatever this is.
Hey, Justin. Hey, Lynn. Thanks for having me today. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm looking forward to this.
Cool.
Yeah.
So take a second.
This is going to be a good reaction show. We had a good guest on our podcast who's done a lot of crazy things and seen a lot and done a lot and achieved a lot and still continues to achieve a lot. And so there's a lot to talk about because he's a pretty busy guy.
Absolutely.
Kate,
I want you to take a second, though.
Yes.
Introduce yourself. What you do here, kind of how you got here, so people know you.
Absolutely. Gotcha. So I am an instructor here at Exterro, and they let me out of my classroom for a little bit to come meet with Justin and Lynn today. I've been here at Exterro for about 8 months. I typically teach the FTK 101 and FTK 201 classes at this point. So I love those 2 classes very much. And I also administer ACE. I'm actually administering 3 ACEs as we speak. So before I was here at Exterro, I managed a private forensic lab in Pennsylvania. And I currently live here in Maryland, just FYI. And I have managed government labs. I've started labs from scratch multiple times. And I also have done civil work. So I cut my teeth in civil work doing, collections, staging for e-discovery for a company called BDO. And then I started doing criminal work after that. Wanted to work in criminal work and get my experience with that. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything. And that's a good summary, I would guess, of where I am today.
so if you're taking an Exterro forensic certification test, which Kate administers, you can't cheat, okay? Because she's had so many jobs and she knows exactly how everything works in the real world. So don't think it's going to be easy. You got to get past Kate.
Yes. No cheating.
Yeah. And if you're taking it, I'm not going to say the date, but if you're taking it right now, all 3 of us are watching you. So
we're all watching you.
You're behind the scene famous, I guess, because you also made this podcast. So, So let's rewind a couple months. We were at Techno in Myrtle Beach. It was a bunch of us, but Kate, you were there. I was there, and there's a lot of people at Techno. Actually, this Techno Myrtle Beach was one of the busiest I have seen in a long time at Myrtle Beach. And I think everybody just wanted out after the COVID stuff.
Yep.
And we were at the booth, and you met or at least ran into Brett there at the booth or near the booth and brought him over, and we all started chatting. How did that all happen? Have you met Brett before, or let us in on that?
No, actually, this was probably my first opportunity. We don't get, when we're in the labs, we don't get let out very often, a lot of times. So this was my first time meeting a lot of the big names in forensics. And so I was having complete fangirl moments. Everybody else is just kind of hanging out at the booth, and I'm going to all the talks and the classes and meeting all these people that, I've used their resources my whole career. So I was really excited to meet Brett. And, it's really, our field is really hard. And especially when I've been in a lab where I'm the only one or one of the only people, or I'm the one that's establishing a lab and that's my job, the resources that Brett has put out there are invaluable to me. And so I just, it was really nice to meet him in person and be able to tell him that. And when I saw him, I was able to talk about his presentation that he gave, and then introduce him to you all and get that conversation going about having him here on the podcast.
Well, I'm glad you did, because it was funny. Brett and I got talking there at the booth, and not the same presentation, but both of us had given presentations that day on the importance of knowing forensics more than just the tool. And so we were like, oh, hey,
Yes.
that was my topic. Or it was just funny that we had both talked on that.
True.
And so I reached out to him. I'm like, hey, obviously this is something that's important to both of us, important to the industry, I think. Let's get on and talk about that on a podcast. And he was super cool about jumping on and doing that with us. And so that's what we want to talk about today. So, Kate, I'm going to float a question to you here, kind of to start off with. Brett starts talking about, with his books, about how to make a course or a manual as timeless as possible. Forensics changes all the time. You mentioned you'd read a lot of his books and starting labs. How was it that you experienced his manuals in that, where, hey, this is talking about general high level concepts, and how did that help you more than, say, like his example is this book's on Windows 10 forensics?
Right. So there are things that change in forensics every day. And no matter how long we work in forensics, we're going to never know all of it, and we're going to have to evolve with it, right? But then there's stuff that never changes for the most part. It might, be adapted here and there, but I would say a lot of our best practices have been our best practices since the dark ages of digital forensics. So the standard operating procedures, establishing a lab with tool validation, being able to testify that your tool didn't alter evidence, being able to, account for the custody and the integrity of your evidence. These are things that are going to be in place as long as we have computer forensics, right? So those high level concepts that he has resources on his current website and past books and websites that he's had are really helpful when you're establishing a lab, your standard operating procedures, what you do for this process, evidence storage. That, I guess, is a really good way for, to write. Sorry, can we cut that last part? You know what I mean, though? Like, yeah. And I apologize.
No, I totally get it, because he mentions in there, and you mentioned it again, the investigative mindset is the investigative mindset. Mm-hmm. And one Absolutely. Of the things that we, I just had a call or an email and a call before that, walking through one of our clients in how to do a thing for their investigation. And he talked about, okay, I've done this thing, and I found what I think is the evidence I need, and I need to send it out to our incident response vendor and possibly the FBI. What do I do with that? And I was like, okay, you got to validate, verify your image hasn't changed through your investigation, and I'm like copy it to a drive and then verify it again. Those types of things are, like you said, those aren't going away. That's always going to happen. The verification of your images through each step of the process is always going to happen. And like you said, those types of resources are going to make a manual and a training and skills last through the whole thing, because you're never going to go wrong. That having been said, have you, I don't know, you were probably doing investigations and lab work back in the day when it's like, okay, you're going to hit a house and you're going to pull the plug instantly when you get there. And I actually saw a meme. I saw a meme. It's the okay, grandma, let's go to bed meme. Are you guys familiar with that one? And it's the old grandma with a walker. And she's like, in my day, we pulled the plug right when we got to the house. And then it's like, okay, grandma, let's get you back to bed. Like, and so things do change, but it's very, very, very minor in the overarching way we approach investigations and that sort of thing.
I would say I came in on the tail end of that just because forensics is my second career. I don't have the traditional route to forensics, but I came in on the tail end of that practice. So.
Yeah, it still lives on though. And that's why I think like things like what Brett is doing, especially these conferences like you went to and attended all the classes, are so important, because it's like, hey, everyone, stop pulling the plug when you go into the house. You got to check for encryption, and that can make for a long day. My last case actually had to fly back while working for Access Data to go to trial for it. Was we hit this house, a lot of stuff went down, of course, with the whatever, but a lot of the day was sitting there at the house making sure this guy's computer didn't go to sleep, because they were interviewing him to try to get the password to his TrueCrypt container. So it was just like the interview was where the work was happening, and we were just sitting there like, okay, don't let his computer go to sleep because we don't want anything to lock up.
Yep, and we've been there with phones with that too.
Yeah. Exactly. So you mentioned setting up labs, running labs, and this was kind of something he talked about, or we talked about as we went through, is the way that we look at who we hire and the skills that we're looking for when we hire. I'm just going to leave it at that and ask you, when you were running your labs, what were some of the things that you looked for in a lab technician, an examiner, or reviewer, whatever you were working with?
Great. So one of them was definitely mentioned in the podcast with Brett, curiosity, number one trait, because you get to the point where you're familiar enough with the operating systems that you're investigating when you see something that isn't where it should be or doesn't look the way it should. And if you're curious, then you'll say, hey, what's this? Like, what's going on here? And you'll explore it. So that's number one. And then number two is attention to detail. Those are two really important things to me, that you are thorough in your documentation of what you do with the evidence, your interactions, and you notice things that need to be noticed and put it in your report. So that's probably the two most important things I look to when I'm hiring. I don't necessarily care whether you have a college degree or tool certifications or other certifications. It's more your problem solving, your attention to detail, ability to see the big picture. Along those lines, though, it is really important that our employees, our examiners, when we hire, you can have technology. You can be a kid that built a computer back, when you were 10 years old, but you have to have people skills to work in forensics. And that makes us kind of an outlier from other computer fields, really, because we have a lot, whether we're in law enforcement or corporate, we have a lot of human interaction that goes on besides, just arresting people. So, there's interaction with lawyers, and that's a special breed of people that you have to know how to interact with well. So we're looking for people that have people skills as well, not just computer skills. So I would say that that's kind of the most important stuff that I look for when I'm hiring.
So I experienced that. I never ran a lab, but I experienced that with my coworkers where they really wanted a SOP, basically. Like, okay, I have this case. These are the things I do, and it's like, it's not. That's not how it happens. And I totally agree that you need to have the curiosity. I would say the investigative mindset, but that kind of narrows it down. But I think curiosity is kind of that thing. Like, I want to figure out how to solve this. Those are harder things to teach. Whereas if they're weak on computers, if they don't know forensic terminology or stuff, that can all be taught. That can be.
Yep, you can teach that. You can teach that. Absolutely.
And especially like with Exterro training, the academy, that's all the stuff that we do teach is like, hey, this button will do this, that button will do that. But, and I think we try to incorporate, here's a little bit of the why, because Kate, you're experienced in forensics, and so are the other instructors. We always try to hire people who've been out there, had their hands on the keyboard doing work. But most of it's making up for, hey, here's a new tool, here's a new thing. Hopefully they can apply their own investigative mindset, their curiosity, their passion for learning to see, oh, that's how I'm going to apply that. Do you ever have students in your class like comment like, oh, that feature there, cool, that's the button, but could I use it like this, or could I do that with it? Have you ever had those experiences?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every time I'm teaching, I'll show them how to do a filter, and they'll all come up with like 3 or 4 other ways to do a filter, or another process that we have in FTK. So, there's a lot of times there's there might be a wrong way, but there's a lot of there's multiple correct ways to do something in forensics as well. So, as long as you test it and make sure that it works, that's the big thing. You're testing before you use it on evidence in the wild. So, absolutely.
Which Brett talks about in there, where he would talk about if he had a new thing, he would read a book on it. If there was no book on it, he would write a book on it. Maybe not a book, but a paper, or get a published thing on it. And I think that plays into the validation that you're talking about. It's like, hey, I remember that was a lot of the time, hey, I have this new thing. You sit and run it through like 6 different processes, tools, software. I say tools, but like, how many times did you run like a SQLite database through Excel just to try to figure out? It's like, that was never what it was built for, but it was great.
No. But we as examiners use it for that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of off topic, but that was my SQLite is one of my favorite things to like play with code, write queries, all this sort of stuff. And I wrote a 5-day class for access data on SQLite databases just in my spare time. So that's kind of nerdy. Wow. But started in...
God, you're such a nerd.
I know.
God.
I know. Started with Excel, though.
No, that's cool.
Started with Excel and VLOOKUP because, like you said, like I had to solve a problem. At the time, I didn't know SQLite. I hadn't gotten Sanderson's forensic browser yet. And so you jump into Excel and, oh, look, I can use VLOOKUP to kind of emulate this, this process of foreign keys, and you just move on. And how do you validate that? Well, now you're looking at the data, and you're looking at good data, and you're looking at bad, and you're just putting it all together. And then when the best part is when you go to court, they're like, yeah, that works. And you're like, I put in days of time into that. And you're like, yeah, that's cool.
Wait, I want to tell you. I want to tell you how it works.
Yeah. They're like, nah.
Yeah.
We don't care.
No, you're exactly right. It's the necessity. That's how we learn in this, because if you're relying on the tool to show you all the evidence, you're missing evidence. And especially these days with mobile forensics, I mean, it's impossible to have all of the databases and all of the apps parsed, right? also to a certain extent with computer forensics, but I would argue that it's like a best practice to check the databases that aren't parsed in your mobile forensics tool. So that's how I learned, SQL, because I needed evidence, and I wasn't seeing evidence in the parsed information and the parsed artifacts. So I had to go find it in the databases that didn't have support, at the time.
Yep. Had a case the same way. It was, I don't remember now what Yahoo's email database was called, but it didn't have the word Yahoo in it. And
mine was AOL, but yeah.
So we're kind of dating ourselves there, but yeah. And you're like, oh, hey, here's what I need, but it didn't parse it. So now, later on, it's like, oh, I'm going to write a SQL query to do that, but maybe loading into Excel, it may be manual, just like, hey, tracking it back and writing the story. But to me though, and this is what I talked with Brett about, maybe it was at the booth, maybe it was on the podcast, I don't know. That to me is like the fun stuff of forensics. Obviously we have a caseload we got to push through, but it's always like exciting to like solve a new thing, to parse a new database, or to find evidence that's not just handed to you.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you mentioned on the podcast, like the dopamine release that you get when you solve a problem, and not only are you figuring this out, yay for you, but it's big news for law enforcement, or it's big news for the defense attorney you're working for, or it's big news for the corporation that you're working for. That is huge and addictive, that feeling,
Yeah.
That's what Brett called the magic, right? He goes, that's the magic of forensics, where, I magically produce this key piece of evidence that, everybody's been looking for. And to your point, you want to tell everybody exactly what you did to find it. And you're like, yeah, but I had to fix this and take this apart and put it back together. And they're like, yeah, attorney's like, that's great. Give it to me. Hurry. I got to run to court.
Yeah.
This is all I need. Thanks. Yep. Bye.
What do I need to know to do my job? That's all they want to hear. So,
yep.
Yeah.
But it does to them, to the outside world who is, not sitting there in a forensic capacity trying to find the information. It is magic to them, because they're like, how did you take this pile of words and, system information and gibberish to most people, and how did you find exactly what I was looking for? Magic. Yep. Yeah. And to your point, if you sit there and go, I don't know, I can't find it. Someone help me. Raise your hand. I need help. I can't find it. No, figure it out. You've got to tinker around and figure it out. You've got to be curious. You can't just raise your hand and wait for someone to come save you and give you the answer, because you have to find the answer.
If you're not going to, take what you're learning in the lab from the other examiners and run with that and start to figure it out yourself, you're not going to last long in any lab, really.
So what we're saying is that if you're, a younger person, or you are parenting younger people, or you're mentoring younger people, or you're teaching younger people, and you've got that younger person who, is constantly fiddling with things, or going outside of their, their computer assignment in school, or, not doing something they're supposed to be doing because they'd rather be fiddling around with something else, like that skill should be cultivated, because you might just be a really good forensic analyst.
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
One of the things that got hammered into me when I got hired at BCI was it's not enough to like know how a computer works. How is data stored? How did something get to that? Try to figure that out so that it informs you to where something might live. And where I found that helps a lot is people will ask me with data carving, like, why isn't this here? Or why does this file look like this is corrupt or something? Well, if you don't know how file systems store data, then you're not going to know how forensic tools carve data, and you're not going to know why you're getting what you're getting. And if you know that, it seems like, why do you need to know that far? Well, I can explain all of this clearly. And then I can also be like, Lynn, you want to recover this data? Well, given how the computers function and the length of time and this, that, and the other thing, maybe not, or this is why you're seeing what you're seeing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why Brett just kind of speaks my language, because I just think that is so important, being able to explain how you got that information and where that information is actually populated, not just, well, the tool told me. I think he said, like, we are interpreting what, wait, no, the tool interprets the data, but we are the ones that need to, A, verify what the tool is saying, and B, um, make conclusions from what the tool is telling us. So um, you have to know that background information. So I struggle um, with certain texts or whatever in my lab environment. How much do they have to know in order to work with the evidence, or to work on a case, kind of a thing? Because I want to make sure that their background knowledge is really firm. um, it's just it's paramount in this field that, if you're taking away someone's liberty, as Brett mentioned, or um, you know you're possibly someone's losing a job over this investigation, or some other serious consequence, it's really important that you're not just looking at what the tool gives you, but you're also just verifying that information.
I think that's super important for even, especially new examiners, new people getting into the forensics, whether like you specified, like Brett said, whether it's enterprise or for law enforcement, whatever that other side is. Someone like our work affects people's lives in some fashion, no matter where you're at. Like you said, even if you're in enterprise, hey, this investigation, if you do it right or whatever, or wrong, I guess either way, somebody could lose their job, keep their job, and the narrative makes a difference. In law enforcement, it's very much liberty. You're either going to prison, especially if you're working a capital case, right? If you're working a capital case and they're facing death penalty, like, talk about responsibility to make sure that you know what you're talking about, that you did it right, and that sort of thing. This isn't like, oh, I shut off a network port and somebody wasn't productive for 2 hours. Well, okay. I mean, that might be a hassle, but nobody went to jail, nobody died. And then on the flip side,
Right.
if somebody, and we actually, so funny story, me and two other guys got hired at BCI within 3 months of each other. And then when they finally let us loose on cases, all of us had, I think there was a total of 5 cases and we had no evidence found. And there was just nothing to, and you get those. But since we were all new, they actually had the senior lab guy come in and verify all of our cases. And fortunately, we were all good. There was just nothing there. But that's an important part of forensics as well, is there's somebody who was facing possible jail time. And I don't know what happened. Digital forensics is just a slice, but facing jail time. Right. And because of our investigation and maybe the lack thereof of whatever, they're not, they're able to stay out of jail for something they may or may not have done. So important to go both ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I'm a big believer. I guess it's there. Not every organization, is that big on making sure that people have that knowledge, that underlying knowledge of being able to, look at a file system, or even like have a piece of evidence with a proprietary file system that you've never seen before and be able to figure that out. But I think it's really important. And I've been on the defense side. I worked law enforcement cases, but I've also been on the defense side a lot. And there's nothing worse than seeing, when I go to review evidence, having the evidence not actually show what law enforcement is saying it showed, and someone has been sitting in jail because of that, right? I mean, that's not a good thing. So we want to make sure that we have those skills when we're examining computers, that we are seeing that the suspect had knowledge of the contraband on their system, that you know where an artifact is located, for example, might be really important for a certain case. So we definitely, I really believe very passionately that that needs to be taught, whether you come in the college route or, you're coming in from your department. A lot of, at least departments around here in Maryland, PA, a lot of times, it's a cop that is moved in that area from another department. So, which I think is how Brett got his start.
Yeah, that's how Brett got his start. That's how Dan got his start. So,
yep.
Yeah, it's very common practice.
Yeah.
So to that, one of the things we talked about was if there is or is not a way for universities to better prep their students or companies to, and how they look at who they hire. In that, because a lot of, like, we have an academic program where we partner with universities, we give them our software, we give them some curriculum, but our curriculum that we give them is very much like, here's how to use the tool, because that's what we are. We're a tool publisher. But we've just spent, Brett and Lynn and I spent like an hour talking about it. We're now going on a half hour talking about how important it is to know more than that. How do you think universities and industry can partner or can work together to better build forensic examiners, both maybe in the way they interview, maybe in the way they train?
It's a really important and really good question. And I have a lot of thoughts on that. So I think it could be a lot better. And I still have a lot of work to do when I hire, even if they have a bachelor degree. I have a lot of work to do to bring them to the point where they can work on a case independently. I'd say probably close to 8 months to a year before they're really, doing analysis independently. So that's a long time to dedicate to somebody. Internships, as you mentioned, and as Brett mentioned, really important. But I think it starts even before that with the colleges. And when I'm hiring, I look at this. Are your professors, have they worked in the field? Have they worked in the computer forensics field? If they haven't worked in the computer forensics field in real life, they don't belong as a professor, in my opinion. We don't hire trainers here at Exterro to train if they haven't worked in the field. They can have all the computer forensic certifications and degrees that they want, but if they haven't experienced it, you can't hire them. So that's a big thing is the school that this person attended, are their professors current? Have they worked in the field? Have their professors worked in the field recently, right? Not they worked for the FBI 20 years ago. That's another thing that I look at. And so a lot of times you'll see a professor that made kind of a lateral move from, maybe they worked in cybersecurity, or they worked in computer science in some respect. And so I've had professors that don't know what the Windows registry is teaching computer forensics. Like, that's a problem. So that's professors, like, increasing the standards of our computer forensics professors. What we expect them to have is really important. As far as the students, I mentioned internships. That's really valuable, and I thought that was really cool that you had a 1-year internship.
Yeah, it was a good time, and it was interesting because I've stayed friends with a lot of the people at the lab there, and my training officer or whatever, they actually let me start working cases fairly early because of that. But it was a long, I think like 6 months waiting for that for me. But they had never had anybody come in with that level of experience at that point. It may have changed now. And they saw the value in that after the fact, but it can really help the company if they promote internships there, because I would say I learned pretty much, I don't want to disparage the school, but most of the important stuff that I learned was working with the police department because it was real cases and it was real problems. And, the detective I worked with is like, yeah, sure, you found that, but now explain it. Like, how did you find that, and where, whatever. And, or, you know what, like, don't do it that way, do it this way, or, all this sort of stuff. And so I was a big proponent of internships. I tried to get them going at BCI, but it's a long political process, especially at a government agency. So powerful. And I can't remember if I talked about this on the podcast, even though I've listened to it like 3 times. That's my life. But I think it's also good for the student in that, especially on the law enforcement side, due to the content that you experience. And when I say law enforcement, I'm going to include defense on that, because it's just the other side of the law enforcement thing.
Still have to look at it. Yeah.
You may get in there in an internship and be like, I can't handle this. CSAM investigations aside, you're still not looking at the best of society at any day, on any day. And I would rather find out while still in school and in an internship where I can say, Kate, you know what, this isn't for me. And we had a planned deadline anyway. Like, I was only here for 6 months to a year, and there's no harm, no foul on either side, because I have worked around people who got into that and were like, oh man, I'm in the wrong field. I can't work with this. And that's tough, because like you said, 8 months to a year, it's a lot of time to invest to have someone be like, hey, I just took another job somewhere else because I couldn't handle this.
Yeah. That's really frustrating. Absolutely. But you're right. I mean, I call it the detritus of people's lives, even if you're not looking at CSAM. Like, there's a lot of stuff on people's devices.
Yeah.
And so, there are still days where I need, to bleach my eyes, even if I'm not working child sex abuse case.
Yeah.
So that's fun. But you have to kind of, an internship is a really good way to kind of validate that. And so when you have interns, your instinct is to kind of protect them and not have them work those cases a little bit, but you have to expose it to them.
Yeah.
Expose them to it.
When I was at Purdue, I had a professor who had actually been deputized by the local law enforcement agency there so that he could consult and work cases with them as well. And I think what a great resource for the police department, because they're getting a guy who spends all of his time in computers and that sort of thing. And what a great resource for him, that professor at the time, because like you said, he's staying current. He's seen the new investigations, what's happening, what are the problems that are really being faced. I feel like that's always the risk of academics, including here at Exterro. When I was in the training department, it's like, okay, I've got to make a positive effort to not just get into my books and just live in my books. And I had to live vicariously through a little bit of contracting that I did on the side, but also through my students, making sure that they kept me in line. But I wonder if we could, as an academic community, promote more professors deputizing with local law enforcement, because it's going to benefit the students, because the professor is going to come back and be like, these are the problems. These are the things that we're facing. Modify the curriculum. The law enforcement agencies are going to get the help that they so desperately need in that space. And then of course the professor is going to get skills and experience and have a good time. Maybe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. Really need a good mix of both. You can have somebody, teaching forensic methodology that's maybe not quite as current, but I would say your professors that are doing mobile forensics, you're going to want them to still have their foot in the door working somewhere.
Yeah. Easier said than done, but I think it's so much worth it because of the benefits across. But of course, there's always like politics and all sorts of shenanigans that have to go through. Brett talked a little bit about that when he was trying to start college curriculums and stuff, you're always dealing with multiple personalities and different objectives, what they want out of the department and that sort of thing. But
That's true.
yeah.
That's a good point.
Any other thoughts you had, Kate, on the podcast? Anything you wanted to mention that stood out to you that we haven't covered so far?
I guess Brett had mentioned like apprenticeships, and there are some schools in Pennsylvania that work with local law enforcement and have a lab. So it's kind of a lab that they share on the campus, and that's a great program, because you have current law enforcement officers managing the lab, working current cases, and you've got students right there, helping work the cases and learning. So that kind of setup is ideal, I think, for teaching them, how to work in the real world, no matter what tool they're using.
Oh, absolutely.
And I would assume that like the actual law enforcement professionals would be maybe not their primary objective, but their secondary objective is to evaluate some of the students that are helping them to identify the personalities and the behaviors, the curiosity, right? The problem solving, like being able to evaluate that in a human being and not just go, oh, what was your grade point average? Well, what grades did you get in this class? And, list all your skills on a resume. And it's like, no, I want to see how you work in a lab, and I want to see what happens when you get stuck. And if you try to find another way around, or go in the side, or go in the back, or flip the thing upside down and see if you can do it that way, like what are you going to do in the real world when faced with a challenge, right? Because the evidence doesn't just wave at you from the hard drive and go, here I am. You have to dig for it. And so, you can't. It's not everything you guys have been saying. It's not necessarily something that you just teach on a checklist. You have to be inquisitive and curious. And so if you had that working arrangement where you had professionals working alongside students, that would be a great way to evaluate who's the right fit and maybe who's not.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great point.
Yep.
I remember working with a detective in my internship, and I'd ask him a question. He's like, that's why I have you here, man. Figure it out. So I was like, okay.
Go get him, Tiger. Yeah.
So
that's perfect.
Well, cool.
Love that.
Kate, thanks for jumping on. We'll have to have you
absolutely
back for another episode of maybe FTK Feature Focus as well. So I have a bunch of junk that we're always making here. It's busy, but thanks again, Kate, for jumping on.
And Lynn, thanks for having me, guys.
Yep. Thank you, Kate.
All right. We'll see you next time.
See ya.